You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 28th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, dictator or deal maker. Volodymyr Zelensky heads to Washington, unsure of what Donald Trump makes of him. Also ahead, in the next 30 minutes, we examine calls by the leader of the PKK to lay down arms and end a 4 decades-long conflict with the Turkish government. And then,
whilst Eurostar has always provided a really effective, efficient service, give or take high prices, it's always been the only player. It's never had competition.
Could the UK be reconnecting to the EU, if only in terms of rail travel? And speaking of heading out to the European road, we'll find out how London productions are heading out onto the road in order to make ends meet. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Last week, Donald Trump called the Ukrainian president a dictator and blamed him for Russia's invasion of his own nation. This week, Donald Trump brushed off the dictator comment, saying he had no recollection of making it, and expressed his admiration for President Zelensky. Well, as we go to air, we're about 3 hours away from Zelensky and Trump's meeting in Washington, hopefully to sign a deal to enable Ukraine to enjoy continued support from America in exchange for access to valuable minerals. Well, joining us now is Ambassador Daniel Freed, who's a former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, currently with the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and he joins us from D.C. now. A very good morning to you, Daniel.
And good morning right back at you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Does it look like Volodymyr Zelensky, like the rest of the world, is rapidly learning the art of the deal?
President Zelensky has handled Donald Trump as well as anybody could. He has shown a mixture of toughness when absolutely necessary, accommodation whenever possible, and flexibility in his tactics. That's the best you can do with Donald Trump. And he is poised to advance Ukraine's interests and the interests of freedom for Europe, freedom and security for Europe, and frankly, the United States. If the conversation with Donald Trump goes well, always open, but it looks as decent as it can be at the moment.
Which is very much the reaction that many other world leaders are experiencing when they go to see him. It is going to be as decent as it could be. One thing that sometimes seems rather uncertain is what Donald Trump expects from meetings such as the one that we're just about to see with Zelensky. And it was suggested that perhaps Donald Trump doesn't know what he wants until he's close to it.
Donald Trump seems to like to throw things up in the air, create chaos, watch people scramble, and then decide what to do. In the case of Ukraine, the framework of a solution the Americans put forth could have a reasonable outcome. It could be the basis for something good. That is, a ceasefire roughly along the line of contact, plus security for Ukraine. The prime minister yesterday with Trump did his best, and he did pretty well, pushing the notion of security to be led by an Anglo-French force inside Ukraine, but backed up by the Americans. Trump didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And Zelensky will also urge Donald Trump to give as much security backing to Ukraine as he can, because without that backing, Putin will just restart the war if he ever agrees to stop it. So security for Ukraine is critical. The minerals deal that Zelensky and Trump are apt to bless, or maybe even sign today, is more of a sketch. It's a framework, which could be pretty good if it convinces Donald Trump that the U.S. has real security and economic interests in Ukraine. It's not the kind of colonial exploitation deal some people feared. The deal is improved. And it is, as I said, a framework rather than a finished product. So all in all, we're poised to make some progress this week. But it has been a rough week. And American policy toward Ukraine has been getting in its own way, leaning forward, then retreating, sponsoring a bad resolution at the United States, Trump calling Zelensky a dictator, then taking it back. We've been stepping on our own lines, but still, out there is the framework of the American plan, which could succeed if Trump leans into it.
Daniel, do we have any more details about what actually is inside this plan? Because you've mentioned that there's a framework, you've mentioned there's a basis of something good. You've also given reassurances that it is not the sort of colonial smash and grab that some people are worried about. And some people have made direct comparisons with what China has been doing in other parts of the world.
Well, I'm talking about two things. One is the framework of a U.S. plan to end the war. That's a ceasefire in place and security for Ukraine. But we're also talking about this minerals deal. And it provides for a fund to be jointly managed by the U.S. and Ukraine. The proceeds of that fund come from exploitation of Ukrainian raw materials and other sources and are supposed to be plowed back into Ukraine for investments. Now, it's not entirely clear whether all of them will be plowed back. Trump talks about extracting money from Ukraine. The Ukrainians talk about support for their long-term development. The framework agreement to be signed today has a little bit of both, and its language is vague. But if it's enough to convince Donald Trump to back Ukraine, well, then it's probably a good thing, and I don't blame Zelensky for signing it.
Ambassador Daniel Fried, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing, where the time here in London is 7 minutes past midday. A look now at the rest of today's headlines. Here's Tom Webb.
Thanks, Emma. Canada's Ontario province has re-elected Premier Doug Ford's ruling Conservatives in an election heavily focused on trade tensions stoked by Donald Trump. Ford and his Progressive Conservative Party made their third consecutive legislative majority in a campaign to protect the economy of Canada's most populous province from Trump's tariffs. 2 years after a devastating train crash in northern Greece, a general strike and hundreds of demonstrations are bringing the nation to a standstill. The protest, led by relatives of the 57 people killed, has been fueled by public resentment against the Conservative government's perceived inaction. Switzerland's government has blocked Zurich's plan for Sunday shopping, citing opposition from business groups and labour unions. The proposal to allow Sunday shopping in tourism zones was deemed too restrictive and impractical, with only stores catering to foreign tourists and selling luxury goods or souvenirs would be allowed to open. While Zurich officials criticised the decision, unions welcomed it, citing worker protections. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom Webb. Now, the leader of the Turkish outlawed Kurdish group, the PKK, has called on his movement to lay down its arms and dissolve itself. Abdullah Öcalan has been in prison for a quarter of a century. He said democratic consensus was the only way forward to end 4 decades of violence in southern Turkey. Well, Hannah Lucinda Smith is Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. She joins us now. Good afternoon, Hannah.
Good afternoon.
So this is the culmination of a series of meetings, isn't it? It's a big jump.
It is a big jump. So this is something that has been developing for the past couple of months here in Turkey. We've had Erdogan and also one of his key political allies, a guy called Devlet Bahçeli, who's a extreme nationalist politician, very, very anti, dealing with the PKK, starting to talk about, getting a statement from Öcalan, perhaps even Öcalan's release. This is what people are expecting now here in Turkey. And also visits to Imrala, which is the island prison where Öcalan has been held, as you say, for the past quarter of a century. It's on an island of Istanbul. And there have been visits by delegations from the main Kurdish party to go and see him, also to go to northern Iraq, where the PKK is also present, to try and thrash out a kind of statement from Öcalan, and the culmination, of course, is what came yesterday. In fact, we were expecting if a statement was going to come, it would probably come in a couple of weeks' time when there's a festival called Nowruz, celebrated by Kurds here in Turkey and elsewhere in the world as a new spring festival. But it has come early. So, yeah, it's something we were expecting. A lot of people were thinking maybe it wouldn't get there. But certainly the news yesterday, I can tell you that everyone here in Turkey was watching that extremely closely.
This conflict has been going on for 4 decades. What's brought about a potential end to it at this moment?
So I think, first of all, we need to look back at previous attempts to bring an end to the conflict. And the last time that Öcalan released this kind of statement wasn't so long ago. It was in 2013. And he basically said the same thing, slightly different, but he called on the PKK to lay down their arms in Turkey. Now, that peace process held for a couple of years. In the meantime, however, the PKK extended its influence in Iraq and also in Syria, where its franchise, a group called the YPG, became extremely powerful and also won Western backing because it was the main, the kind of head of the spear in the fight against ISIS. And, for that reason, also Kurdish fighters have really kind of, boosted their reputation right across the world. Now, again, it's things that are happening in Syria that have prompted this development now. Clearly, since the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December, the lines have been redrawn in Syria. And what's happening now is that the new government in Damascus and also Turkey are really trying to put pressure on the Kurdish administration in the northeast to give up their weapons and to merge with the new Syrian government. So really, for Turkey, Erdogan saw a chance here. It's at a point where really the PKK and its franchises are under pressure from all over the place, and also in Syria, knowing that they are not going to receive that US backing that they enjoyed in the past. The US has really lost interest in the Middle East. They've kind of used the Kurdish forces in Syria for what they want to do, to get rid of ISIS, finish the caliphate. And really, the Kurds are in a bit of a difficult position in Syria now. So really, it's the moment when Erdogan felt that he could really take this opportunity.
So is this looking like defeat for the PKK?
Here is the big question. Öcalan, he was the founder of the PKK. He's remained as this kind of figurehead. Whenever you go to, events that are organised by the PKK or their offshoots, or go to places like northeastern Syria, his image is everywhere. He's almost seen as this sort of, deity figure. And he has, as I mentioned, released statements in the past. However, he has not tangibly been in charge of this group for the past quarter of a century. And in that time, they've actually expanded, both in terms of their international image, in terms of the territory that they hold. In Turkey, the last peace process here broke down in 2015 and led to some really intense violence in the east of Turkey. And now the PKK, really their main presence is in Iraq and Syria. But I think already there are statements and signs that many of these PKK fighters and leaders on the ground are not going to listen to this kind of statement. They've developed in their own way. And while Öcalan is a figurehead, he's not practically in charge of this group anymore.
Hannah Lucinda Smith in Istanbul, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. You're with Monocle Radio. Eurostar is about to get some competition for train services from the UK to Europe that could finally allow travellers to visit a whole host of other European cities. UK rail regulators are promising to free up track space into the Channel Tunnel and clear the way for competitors to challenge Eurostar's monopoly on the route. Well, earlier Monocle's Chris Chermak heard from Paul Charles, the founder and CEO of luxury travel and trade consultancy, the PC Agency, and the former director of Eurostar, about the changes.
This is a significant change because the plan all along for Eurostar, of course, when it was created over 30 years ago, was for it to properly connect parts of the UK with all parts of Europe. So you'd be able to go in the wild dreams of the planners, from Manchester to Marseille. You'd be able to go from Leeds to Liège. You'd be able to go on numerous routes. And that never happened. It didn't happen for various reasons. Lots of things got in the way. The financial crisis in 2008, the lack of demand in the early years of Eurostar, and then, of course, COVID. So lots of hurdles got in the way of a plan to connect the UK far more with other parts of Europe. And now what we're seeing is the owners of the infrastructure and the operators of the infrastructure, like Eurotunnel, the Channel Tunnel, who are now called GetLink, basically saying we're prepared to open up these tracks that exist to allow more capacity and new operators to connect London properly with other parts of Europe. So the dream is to connect London with Cologne or Frankfurt or Zurich much more than has been done in the past.
Paul, the way you describe the reasons that this hasn't happened before there suggests that it's something, that had to do with demand, financial crisis, all of that. Why was Eurostar itself then not able to take that on? Or to ask the question another way, why is this step significant by basically opening this up to competitors to Eurostar?
That's exactly what it is. It's the untapped potential. It is possible now to open up to new operators and provide competition to Eurostar. And whilst Eurostar has always provided a really effective, efficient service, give or take high prices, it's always been the only player. It's never had competition. And now the infrastructure owners are saying, we want that competition. We want to make things easier so that Eurostar faces competitors. And that should lead to better pricing for consumers. Eurostar never had the incentive really to lower prices because it never had competition. So now there is the option, and also in the context of many passengers wanting more sustainable travel options, now there is the option for the realization and the delivery of easier travel to more places other than just Paris and Brussels.
And who are the likely competitors that are expected to take this on? Who would use the tunnel, and how might their services differ from that of Eurostar?
Well, there are certainly some high-profile possibilities who've said they're very interested in operating services. Sir Richard Branson, and I must admit, he's my former boss when I used to work at Virgin Atlantic. He has expressed interest via the Virgin Group to operate services, as have a Spanish operator called Evelyn, who are new. They've been set up by investors in the coach company National Express. So those are two possible players. Others have been rumoured, such as Deutsche Bahn, the German railway firm. So we could see two or three operators who come in, bring in fresh technology, with cheaper operating costs, are able to lower prices for consumers and provide a competitor service to Eurostar. And why not? I mean, that's what should happen. You get competitors operating airline routes from A to B. There should be competitors to Eurostar using that, what has always been very expensive tunnel infrastructure.
It has been expensive tunnel infrastructure, but also the rail infrastructure, the train station infrastructure, that is something that might need to be upgraded if this is going to happen. I understand that St. Pancras here in London wants to triple the number of passengers it handles in order to accommodate this. Is that wishful thinking?
Well, it's needed and it can be done. It's a bit of a squeeze at St. Pancras. Don't forget, it was designed in certainly 2000 or pre-2000 before it came on stream in 2006. It needs to be realigned. It's too full at peak times. They need to be able to get 5,000 people in at peak times. And not just at the London end, not just at the St. Pancras end. There would need to be changes to platforms and terminals in Cologne or Frankfurt or Zurich and Marseille to be able to squeeze in more passengers and more services. So that's costly in itself, but it's very realistic. It's very doable by 2030, just in 5 years' time, to create the right infrastructure so that passengers have a smooth and, of course, safe experience.
And just finally, Paul, when you mentioned that in the past there have been questions about the demand for this, that was maybe one reason why Eurostar has not taken this on itself in terms of expanding services beyond the routes it currently offers. Do you expect people to use these new services if they are brought online?
That's the challenge. There's certainly pent-up demand to use train services because they're more sustainable, they're cleaner, they're often more efficient. You're going from city centre to city centre, so you don't have to take a taxi or train to get out to an airport a long way out of a city. There's every reason why these services should work, but as we know, consumers are driven by price, and they've been put off in the past by high prices, for example, when Eurostar have tried to operate between London and Avignon in the south of France. The prices have been too high, so it hasn't been worth it for Eurostar. If we see more competitors come in to Eurostar and more operators, that should bring down prices. It should be a lever for lower prices to attract consumers who will definitely want to go from London to Cologne by train if the price is right. Price is king.
Paul Charles from the PC agency there, talking to Monocle's Chris Chermack. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. We head to Japan now, where the World Expo is setting up in the city of Osaka, an event that happens every 5 years. This year's theme is rather ambitious. It's designing future society for our lives. Well, joining us now is Fiona Wilson, Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief and Senior Asian Editor. Good afternoon, Fiona.
Hi, Emma. Lovely to hear you.
Good to have you with us. Now, you've been down to have a look at this. So what's happening?
Yeah, I'm literally fresh off the bullet train. I was there yesterday, incredibly sunny day. It was a really good day to see what is still largely a bit of a construction site. So the event actually opens in mid-April, so still a few weeks out. But yeah, they're putting the finishing touches to an awful lot of pavilions. It's huge. It's 155 hectares. You've got dozens of country pavilions, each country representing itself. And then you've got this enormous wooden structure that's been designed by the master planner for the event is So Fujimoto, a very distinguished Japanese architect. And he's designed this enormous circular structure, which is sort of inspired by a traditional Japanese bridge. It's meant to say something about traditional wooden construction in Japan, and that encloses these pavilions. And I think it's a good idea because it's all built on this big flat man-made island called Yumeshima, which is just sort of at the edge of Osaka, and it gives it some sense of being a little bit enclosed. And I'm really interested to see how it all softens up, because Japan in February is very dry. The grass is looking at its most yellow, and I think it all needs a bit of rain and a bit of foliage.
Tell us a little bit about the theme of this. I mean, I mentioned at the start, designing future society for our lives. It's pretty ambitious, pretty broad as well. Do we actually know what that means?
Yeah, I was worried you were going to ask me about that theme, because I feel like it's quite opaque, isn't it? And I noticed that it's generally the theme for most of the modern expos. It's thinking about the future. It's offering up ideas about how people live. And, obviously you've got loads of different countries with many different issues. I think a lot of people I notice are leaning into sustainability, climate change, all sorts of different subjects like that. Yesterday, my main purpose was going to see the Women's Pavilion, which is it's sponsored by Cartier, and they took a little troupe of journalists to see how they're getting on. And it's a really interesting proposition, because how do you kind of get worldwide women's experience into one small pavilion? How do you do that subject to any justice? So they've hired Ez Devlin, one of the world's best set designers, and she's working with Japanese architect as well, Yuka Nagayama, a very famous Japanese woman architect. And together they've created... They've gone really sort of micro to explain the macro, and they've honed in on 3 different women and sort of gone through their life experience. And they're using technology to do that, but in a way that's very, very quiet. And I found it very, very relaxing to be in there. Actually quite moving. They picked a woman from Japan. She's actually a famous novelist, Banana Yoshimoto, a woman who'd come from Sudan, Darfur, and then they had a climate activist from the Amazon. And you go through a sort of like a tunnel, really, and you get vignettes of their life. And yeah, it's really interesting to see how do you achieve your big message in a fairly small space, and you're surrounded by other pavilions. So carving out your message in that small space is a real art, I would say.
And it is, given the fact of how enormous it is. I mean, I think they're expecting, 28 million visitors. And there is that sense, or questions are now being asked, aren't they, about what purpose expos actually serve, given the fact that quite a lot of people have chosen to live their lives online. But the importance of having an enormous fair, which kind of represents or reflects the way that society and the world moves, is a hugely, one wonders, how they make it relevant now.
Yeah, I mean, there's always... technology is clearly going to play a big part in this expo. And it was interesting, as Devlin was talking about that, it's using technology in a way that is sort of meaningful, not just flashy, splashy, huge LED screens. We've got enough of that in our life. It's sort of trying to... I think what they tried to do with the Women's Pavilion was have technology where you can really see the people that they're talking about. And you can, at one point, you can even put your hand into the wall and a message lights up on your hand. So it's technology that sort of interacts with the human. There's going to be no shortage of splashy technology. I've looked at some of the designs for the country pavilions, and it's definitely, people are really... they're showcasing what they make, I suppose, as well. But yeah, I think it is interesting about the whole idea of what is an expo in the modern world. Japan had an expo in 2005. It was in Aichi, in the middle of Japan. And that subsequently became the Ghibli theme park, the Studio Ghibli, the famous animation studio. It became their theme park. So funnily enough, that expo has really embedded itself into the country's psyche because people love the theme park, and so there's a sort of legacy there. And Osaka itself had an expo in 1970. I love that era of Japanese design, and you can still go to the old expo park in Osaka. It's a bit of a pilgrimage for architecture nuts like me, and I really enjoy going to see the old structures. They're still really good, amazing, huge sculpture by Taro Okamoto, who's a famous artist, no longer with us, but he left this enormous sculpture called Tower of the Sun, and it's an absolute landmark in Osaka. So it's interesting. I think the expo can sort of be whatever it wants to be. It just depends on the era, I think. And I think this time there are just so many issues. And So Fujimoto said part of the reason he wanted to enclose the space in this warm wooden circle was, this sense that the world is very fractured. And bringing everyone together and stabilising it within this structure, he thought was very timely. And I don't think he's wrong.
Fiona Wilson in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. And if you are interested in the Expo 2025 Osaka, then just pick up a copy of the latest edition of Monocle magazine. We have a 24-page booklet exploring the relevance of the modern Expo and also talking about the Austria-Japan partnership and how it is playing a role in this year's Expo. You're listening to The Briefing. Finally, on today's programme, let's have a look at what's happening on the stage. Matt Wolfe is theatre critic at the International New York Times and joins us now here in the studio. Good afternoon, Matt.
Good afternoon to you, Emma.
We have an international theme to this, don't we? We're talking when plays, operas, ballets, you name it, start in one place but are configured to travel.
That's right. And I've been spending a lot of time recently at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. You might think, why? Because I'm a theatre critic. And the reason is
it's a nice place to go.
It's a very nice, it's very beautiful. It's very comfortable and elegant. But also the work they've been doing, I have to say, is pretty extraordinary and is theatre adjacent and truly international. Yesterday, the 27th of February, was the last performance in London for the moment of a contemporary opera by Mark Antony Turnage called Festin. However, this is a co-production with Finnish National Opera and Ballet, so we'll go on to a further life on the continent. And the thing with contemporary operas, as with dance pieces, is that they exist to become part of the repertoire. So they're seen a first time and then they return. This is, I have no hesitation in saying, the most exciting piece of theatre of any kind that I've seen in the last year or more. It's one of these perfect convergences of text, music, and staging. A lot of people know the title. It was a very popular Danish movie by Thomas Vinterberg from 1998, translated as The Celebration. Then the Almeida in Islington did it as a play with a very young Tom Hardy. That production moved to Broadway with a different cast. Here it's a Mark Anthony Turnage opera about a 60th birthday celebration that turns out to be pretty horrific.
Let's have a listen to it. Okay, I'll be honest with you, that's quite a hard listen cold.
I think the music is actually quite staggering because it pays homage along the way to Benjamin Britten, and there are, in fact, Alan Clayton, who's one of the brilliant performers in it, has done Benjamin Britten at the Royal Opera House, in fact. But you've also got kind of bits of jazz thrown in, and the libretto is by Lee Hall, who's the Newcastle-born writer, who gave us Billy Elliot. So it's got a foot in multiple camps, but it seems absolutely its own beast. I must give a shout out to Miriam Buter's extraordinary design. She's a big theater designer as well, which shows you a drop curtain of a sofa that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the end, you see the young family members on this sofa knowing the horrific events that will happen or have happened to them. And it is devastating.
You mentioned there the fact that when you put something new on, it has to be part of a repertoire.
Yes.
And the reason for that is, dare we say it, not 100% creative, because when you have somewhere like the Royal Opera House commissioning new stuff, and this is where we get to the international bit, it is generally done in conjunction with about 2 or 3 different locations, because that's the only way you can get funding. That's the only way you can make the business model work.
Sure, of course. And most operas now, in fact, a lot of theater productions are collaborations globally. I mean, that's the way to kind of square the financial circle. And that segues very neatly, actually, to Light of Passage, because Light of Passage, the Crystal Pite piece at the Royal Ballet at the moment, running in repertoire to March 12th, so listeners can still go to see it. It began as a one-act called Flight Pattern in 2017, and that was a Royal Ballet entity. But then it added a second and a third act called Covenant and Passage, respectively, bringing youth and old age into the mix. And when they came along, guess who entered the equation? Norwegian National Ballet. So Norwegian National Ballet has now done the piece on the continent. Meanwhile, it remains in the repertory of the Royal Ballet. It's an extraordinary piece about the migrant refugee crisis. And I have to say, Crystal Pite, who is herself Canadian, deploys bodies en masse like I've almost never seen on stage. They're kind of one huge undulating, writhing configuration from which she picks out individuals for moments of loss, displacement, grief, bereavement. And it's quite staggering. That's the first half hour. Then there's a break, and then you get kind of further amplifications on the theme.
Do you get, when you start to think in a sort of like a hard and fast financial way, when you know, just saying this has to work monetarily, Norway became interested because it had seen something that had happened in London.
Yeah.
Do you find things like certain themes or subjects have to be adhered to because you know that they will travel? You can't make anything too geographically or culturally specific.
Well, I mean, the thing is, look, Festen is about a birthday party, and everyone has birthday parties. And, the migrant movement is obviously a global issue. So I suppose, yes. But on the other hand, they often say that from the particular is the universal. So it sort of depends. I mean, look, there are plenty of very specific operas that are done in, global collaborations around the world. But I think in the case of Light of Passage, I can't imagine any ballet company with a shred of empathy not having some interest in it.
You mentioned the Almeida Theatre a moment ago. Yes. in the context of Festen.
Yes.
You wanted to talk about
their new show.
A show there, which you said actually, we've been talking about the international nature of productions, but this is something that you could not see coming to light in the United States nowadays.
Here is the converse to what we're talking about. This is a beautiful, I think, new play by the Sheffield writer Chris Bush, whose recent musical Standing at the Sky's Edge won the Olivier for Best Musical. And it's on themes that include infertility and particularly transphobia. And if anyone has been following what's been going on in the U.S. in the last couple of weeks, there are all sorts of issues that are red flags for for Donald Trump's government, one of which is the issue of trans rights. And that is exactly the thematic of this play, which is about a couple who we witness breaking up, Joe and Harry. Joe has fertility issues. Harry is grappling with their new life as a trans person, and it's about how they kind of move forward. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful play, wonderfully acted by Jade Anuk and Fizz Sinclair. I don't know if it'll ever become an opera, and it's certainly unlikely to become a ballet, but as a piece of theatre, it's very much worth seeing.
Matt Wolfe, thank you so much as ever for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing's back on Monday at the same time. The Monocle Daily's live at 1800 here in London. 5.5 hours to go before that, ladies and gentlemen. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great weekend.